Okay, I'm good. Okay. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. I am Michelle Grupe. I'm the Executive Director of Cope Family Center here in Napa, and we are thrilled that you could join us today on this beautiful spring day in April. This is a wonderful collaboration between a number of partners in the community and beyond our own borders here in Napa. Want to first acknowledge Napa Valley College and all of their staff for the wonderful location that we have. Resilient Napa is a collaborative project of Cope Family Center, and we are happy to work with our partners, the Greater Bay Area CAPC, and Strategies to bring this presentation to you today. So I'd like to introduce Deborah Son from Strategies, and we'll get started very shortly.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Sorry, I'm a little short for this. Can you still hear me? Okay, great. My name's Deborah Son. I'm actually the Learning Communities Facilitator for Strategies 2.0. I was tiptoeing a little bit, thank you. So just a little bit about Strategies so that you have an idea of the various partners involved in this event. Strategies 2.0 is actually an organization, let me change the slide. That is a collaborative project between the Child Abuse Prevention Center, the Children's Bureau, as well as San Diego State University. Our organization is actually dedicated to supporting professionals across the state of California in capacity building opportunities, technical assistance, consultation, and all of these services are actually free throughout the state. We've been extremely honored to do some phenomenal work lately, and we've actually been recently partnering with Napa County to develop a child abuse prevention plan, which is ongoing at this time. Ways that you can get connected to us here at Strategies 2.0 is to get into our website, strategiesca.org, and you can sign up for our free newsletter, you can sign up for our trainings, or attend a future learning communities. So today's event is a learning community, and what makes learning communities particularly distinct is that it's different from a training in the sense that we want to invest in folks who have a commitment to family strengthening. And we do this not by just bringing dynamic and relevant topics for folks to learn about, but also creating space for us to get to know each other so that we are more interconnected in the work that we do. And that's really important, especially given how tough our work can be. And particularly even as a community member, things can be very tough to continue to find the positive. So we want to make sure and invest in that energy and keep growing it. So what I want to do right now is acknowledge that right now we're obviously at Napa Valley College. You'll notice that we have a lot of technology set up. So here we're actually at the hub, what we call the hub site. You'll notice there's a webcam that Michelle and I will periodically take a look at, and that's because the learning communities is regional, and we're right now in the Bay Area region, and it's important for us to engage folks in different parts of the region. So our two remote sites right now that are being live streamed as we speak are folks in Concord, California, Contra Costa, and folks in Monterey. So you'll see them there right now. So this is important to recognize because these folks are waving to you all because I'll pause a little bit for some relationship building. It's important to recognize because we want to make sure that we're all connected in this work and in these conversations, regardless of where we're physically located. So you'll notice that we'll take a pause, whether it's for technology purposes and transitioning, or to make sure that we're giving space for the folks at the remote sites to ask questions and provide comments as well.
I gotta find the right one now.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Woo. Lots of stuff up here.
Lots of stuff going on.
So we're going to begin today by watching the documentary Resilience. We have been screening this documentary for about a year and a half here in Napa and hope to continue to be able to do that, as well as the documentary Paper Tigers. As part of the Child Abuse Prevention Council of Napa County and the steering committee, one of the things that we are really focused on doing is community education and awareness about how the impact of adverse childhood experiences then further impacts the growth and development of children, how it impacts their educational outcomes, their relationships with their peers at work and in the community. And so we've been fortunate to be able to show this documentary over the last year and a half to over 1,000 community members, and we continue to kind of plug away at that. So this will be kind of an introduction today into what ACEs are, how they impact our later health and well-being, and then we'll be able to welcome Dr. Flojan Coffer to continue a conversation that she started in February around how ACEs present themselves in terms of race and health equity in the larger picture.
So really quickly, I do want to mention that right after the screening, the content of this film can be extremely heavy. So if anybody needs to take a break, get some fresh air, quickly walk around, feel free to do so for as long as you need. We want to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves and each other. And so what I want to mention is that we don't have a debrief scheduled right afterwards because we're going to go directly into Flojan's presentation. But what I want you to do is actually take some notes during the screening so that we can do some reflections and sharings during the discussion portion at the very end of the day. And really quickly, we will also be passing out evaluations. It's so important for us to know that we are adequately supporting folks who are doing this work or living in these communities. And so please do fill out the evaluations we pass out towards the end. We want your candid feedback about how today's experience was for you all.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Is everybody in Concord and Monterey with us? I hope so. This isn't real time, I have to understand. Okay, well, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the documentary. That was just a warm up. The rest of the afternoon is where the real magic happens, and the star of the show is going to join us. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Flojan Coffer.
Good afternoon, everyone. I decided to opt out of watching the video again because I feel like I could at this point probably recite the entire video myself. I've seen it so many times, and I was also on a call with our team working on All Children Thrive. So I was doing my best to kind of juggle two things while getting prepped for this and also listening in to make sure there was nothing they needed from me on our weekly 2:30 call. So thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be back. I was here on February 20th. How many people in the room were here on February 20th? Okay, so there will be a brief review of what I talked about on February 20th. I will tell you now, I'm not going to do Star Wars all over again, but I can always give you the hot take of that, and I've probably posted it on social media several times. But we're going to start just to do a brief recap for those who weren't here before, and for those who may be a little bit new to this topic. But what I heard on the evaluation is that people wanted from part 2 to talk about, okay, now what? How do we build resilience? Now that we understand the problem, right? And public health is really great at defining problems. We do this all the time, right? We tell you all about health disparities, and we can lay out, all the historical frameworks and how all these things pull together. But then when it comes to, great, what are we going to do about that now? Like, you just told us everything that's wrong in the world, and I'm ready to cry into my popcorn. And I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do about this. And so it can be a little bit demoralizing. And so what we're going to do today is talk about some of the promising practices and the emerging evidence that we have to be able to say there actually is something we can do about this. It's not all hope is lost. And so that's where we want to leave you today. So I'm hoping that maybe last time we left you a bit in a valley of, what does this mean? And hopefully we end here on an optimistic note of, here are all the promising things that we can do in the future and the great work that we have ahead of us. So with that being said, we're going to jump right in. So last time I talked a little bit about ACEs as adverse childhood experiences, but also ACEs as adverse community experiences. And I think this is an important framework for us to just understand. So very briefly, you just saw the video about adverse childhood experiences, but these are measures of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction that happen before someone turns 18. And one of the big things about this is that we learned about it in an obesity clinic in San Diego, that this does not come out of child development. This did not come out of the places we might expect. This wasn't even actually initially a mental health or mental wellness, discovery. This was found as we were trying to engage in sort of core public health and helping people to lose weight in order to be able to improve many of their chronic disease outcomes. And what we found is that when they started to lose enough weight, that people noticed that people were rapidly dropping out of the program, which is the exact opposite of those of us who study stages of change behavior would expect, right? The idea is that you do this rapid start, that people experience early success. It's a great motivation to continue on, and that they are better equipped to meet their goals. And what we found was that the exact opposite was happening, that they were experiencing early success, and then they were more likely to drop out of the program. And so the question became, well, why? And what Dr. Folletti and Dr. Anda discovered was that they were dropping out because they weren't feeling emotionally safe. Because for these patients who were significantly overweight, we weren't talking about, having a few pounds to lose, but these patients all had over 100 pounds to lose. And what was happening was when they lost enough weight that people started to notice. And our culture, the thing that we do is we start to then ask the really inappropriate questions that we reserve for people who've lost weight and people who are pregnant. And those questions are things like, what does your poop look like? Why would you want to know that? Why would anybody think that was an appropriate question to ask another adult, right? Things like, what are you eating? How much do you weigh now? Questions that you would never ask somebody under other circumstances unless they're pregnant or they've lost significant weight. And then suddenly all social convention goes out the window and we lose all of our home training and we start to ask people we don't even know, really invasive questions, or possibly, as we do to pregnant women, touch their stomachs, right? In this way that we would never do to anyone else. And so that was what was happening to them. And what it did was it made many people in the intervention feel unsafe, because now the very thing that had in some ways been a protective factor for them was now the thing that people were paying most attention to, was their bodies. And especially for people who had physical, sexual, or emotional abuse in their childhood, this made them feel unsafe. And so their adherence to the program had absolutely nothing to do with their ability to count and moderate their calories, their ability to get enough physical activity on a regular basis. What it had to do with was they did not feel emotionally safe to continue on in the program because of the social convention around how we were responding to their success in the program. And so that was really eye-opening. And then luckily, Dr. Anda, who happens to be an epidemiologist, shout out to my profession, woo woo. So he came along and said, okay, you've seen this in this clinic, this obesity clinic. I think you're onto something. I think this is bigger than just weight loss. I think this is not something that we should just confine to, to something that feels extreme, right? Because these weren't just patients who were obese. These are patients who had in the hundreds of pounds to lose. And so there's a way that we can sort of marginalize, well, that's not relevant to the rest of the population. That's just them. And Dr. Anda said, no, I think it's more than just them. I think it's a lot of us. And so they went back and did this study in Kaiser in San Diego with 17,000 patients in 1998, so now 21 years ago. And what they found was that these measures of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction were associated with behavior, physical, and mental health outcomes in adulthood, and that there was a dose-response relationship. So the more of the abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction you had before you turned 18, the more likely you were to experience these poor health outcomes. And dose response is one of what we call the postulates of causality for those of you who studied epidemiology. It's one of the things that we always try to look at to see, does this cause that, right? To make sure that we're actually linking things that are appropriate. And so one of them is temporality, right? You don't want the effect to happen before the cause, because then that clearly means the effect can't be the, the thing that causes the outcome, right? And the second thing that we want to make sure is that if we have more of the cause, do we see more of the effect? Are these related in some way? And that's exactly what they saw. That for people who had 4 or more ACEs, that they were much more likely to experience these outcomes, and 6 or more actually lived up to 20 years less than people who had no ACEs. And that was an incredibly important finding, because now we're starting to recognize there may be something to the mechanism of this. And then we started to take a next step and look at adverse community experiences, right? And these are when we're looking at the community, the institutions, and society. And so this is everything from, we many people in California all witnessed what happened with the campfires, especially those of us in Northern California. The air quality up here was terrible throughout the entire region. And so there's an epicenter when something like that happens, where the people who experienced the campfire and lost their homes or were directly in the fire are right at the center of it. But then it ripples out to the rest of the community. And so those of us who were impacted by the air quality and had schools shut down and were unable to be outside, all of those things were all part of that community trauma that was experienced. And that's one type, right? The natural disasters, when we experience hurricanes or floods or earthquakes or wildfires, that's one time. Another kind is when we experience community violence, when we're experiencing racism and things that are happening in a community that are felt throughout that community. When we pass legislation that makes people in your community feel unsafe, that's all part of our adverse community experiences. And so we have to recognize that people may be experiencing ACEs at an individual and household level, and then also may be experiencing them at the community level. And so many of the people who are vulnerable to both. And what does that look like when you're not experiencing safety in your community and you're also not experiencing safety in your home? So again, thinking about some of the sources of these traumas, right? We can look at the family, and we can think about all of those, abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction measures. So physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, the same thing for neglect, witnessing domestic violence, parental alcohol abuse or drug use or mental illness, and then a loss of a caregiver from death, divorce, or incarceration. So all of those things are part of the family, and that's what we're thinking about when we think about the traditional ACEs. But then we have to remember that people exist within a context, and that context is their community and their broader social factors. And so when we think about the communities, we're now looking at schools and neighborhoods. And so some of the same things can exist there. And when they do, and when our responses to them can make people feel very unsafe. So when we think about the Me Too movement and the fact that women are coming out and talking about the ways in which they've experienced sexual assault, that is part of the broader context of us shifting from a culture of silence, a culture of rape apology, a culture of blaming victims, to being more supportive. And what does that look like in terms of building resilience when we're saying to people, we hear you, but we believe you and we support you, versus when we were saying, well, what did you have on and how much did you have to drink and how short was your skirt? That's a very different culture and that we're existing in. And so it has a different impact on people who are experiencing those things. The same thing with bullying and teasing, or having a lack of safe housing or even transportation or basic services, right? All those are the things that are happening within the community. And then we have to think about those broad social factors. And so this is where we're talking about personal and structural racism. This is where we're talking about concentrated poverty, the things that are the result of redlining and lots of housing policies that have happened since then that have concentrated people into certain communities and made it very difficult for them to leave and to afford to live in other communities. The lack of social networks and support, and also then the forced displacement, which has happened for a lot of reasons. We can think about it from the Native American perspective and what it looks like to experience genocide and forced displacement. We can also look at it from gentrification and the way that rising housing costs have caused people to leave communities that they've lived in for forever, and what that does in terms of their ability to have those social networks. So for all of these reasons, right, that is your brief primer. That's like my 2-slide summary of what we talked about for an hour last time. For all of these reasons, we have to focus on trauma. Trauma has to become a priority, because the truth is that emotional safety is one of our core needs. It's one of the ones we often overlook, right? It's one of the ones that we are least likely to attend to, and that sometimes even we're best able to mask in ways. And so a lot of the intractable public health issues that we're trying to face are really our own sort of coping mechanisms and responses to things that we're unable to talk about and where there's a lack of social support for them. And so when we begin to think about some of those problems in this context, we recognize that we have for decades just completely overlooked some primary risk factors for some of the outcomes that we're actually interested in. And so if we're doing obesity prevention work and we're not thinking about trauma, if we're doing heart disease work and we're not thinking about trauma, if we're doing diabetes prevention and we're not thinking about trauma, we are missing a critical ingredient to what is increasing the risk for some of these outcomes. And so the real thing that we have to do here is we have to begin to change the frame. And that's really where the resilience comes in. And so we have to stop asking ourselves, what's wrong with you? And we have to start asking what happened to you, because it shifts our perspective from one where we're blaming people to one where we're curious about what may have happened to them. And curiosity leads us to think about barriers and leads us to really come up with better solutions. So part of the reason why it's important to consider trauma and to consider resilience is because there are different types of stress that come about from trauma. And so it's important for us to recognize that all stress is not bad stress. That stress comes in different types. And the type of stress that we're talking about is really the toxic stress. But there's also positive stress, right? Before I got up here, I recognized I was sweating a little bit. And I was a little bit nervous and my knee was shaking. And I was like, okay, and that's because I want to do a good job. I want you to walk away today having learned something you didn't know coming in. And that is a positive stress. Any of you who've ever played sports or ever done anything that you really cared about and you were nervous before you did it, that is likely a positive stress. It's one of those things that's short-lived and is necessary for our healthy development. So that is a good stress. And when I'm finished here and you all think I'm a rock star, I will feel great about it, and that stress will have definitely been worth it. But then we have tolerable stress. And tolerable stress is the kind of stress that we would expect to experience throughout our lives. It's the type of thing where we know throughout our lives that we're going to have disappointments, that we're going to experience certain losses and traumas, and we're going to experience some stress because of that. But the difference here is that it's either limited in duration or we have some coping mechanisms to be able to help us through it, even as devastating as it may be. But when we think about toxic stress is extreme, it's frequent, or it has extended activation of our body's stress response systems. And often it goes along with not having adequate resilience factors to be able to help us cope. And so the thing that can turn something that should be tolerable stress into toxic stress is often if it's intense, prolonged, repeated, or unaddressed. So when we just completely push it under the rug and say that didn't happen, or we're going to ignore that, that's often where we experience the toxic stress, because there's no way to be able to get that coping and that buffering that we need to be able to deal with the stress and tolerate it and eventually go back to homeostasis or to where we started. And the thing that can turn something that could be toxic into something that, is actually tolerable and that we resolve is by having that social emotional buffering and having some parental resilience or a trusted adult relationship in your life, having early detection or effective intervention. And so when we have those things, those are some of our resilience factors. And so when we talk about building resiliency, those are some of the things that we want to build. And so we need to think about not just how we do that on an interpersonal level, but how we do that on an institutional and structural level. And that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk to you about more today. So when we think about resilience factors, one of the first, surveys that was created, or instruments, I should say, that was created, was this resilience factor one, and it's 14 items, very similar to the ACEs, questionnaire in terms of asking, as a child, did you believe or feel these following things? And the reason that I've highlighted 7 of them is because there are 14 resilience factors. And we often talk about screening people for ACEs, and I think that is incredibly important because it can be illuminating to people that something's not wrong with them, that they experience this stress and this toxic stress, and that this may be the reason why they've had some of the coping mechanisms they have throughout their lives. But I also think it's important that when we look at the people who have some of the worst outcomes because of this, and the ones who don't, yet they still had some of these same stressors, often the difference is resilience factors. And so it's also helpful to help people to look and say, wow, I may have had an ACEs score of 9, but I also had a resilience score of 12, right? And so that is part of the reason why I've been able to handle some of the things that have happened to me throughout my life. That is important. And so I highlighted 7 of them because these are the ones that don't have anything to do with your household and your family. And I think it's important to call that out, because if you're a glass half full person like me, that means that I can build up half of your resilience factors without having to change anything about where you live and what's going on in your household. And so if you're working in public health, if you're working in clinical medicine, if you're working in schools, if you're working in youth development programs, if you're working in any of those other spaces, it is important to remind ourselves that, yes, I cannot go back and make sure that your mother and father loved you and that somebody played with you as a baby and all of these things that are deeply rooted in your family, right? But what I can do is think about the opportunities I have to build your resilience. And I have 50% of them potentially under our control. And so what can we do as the institutions that you interface with in your communities and within the broader societal context to make sure that we take full advantage of that, instead of crying into our popcorn once again about the fact that I can't change what happened to you in the first whatever years of your life before you interface with our institution. So I'm hoping that that is again, a feeling of optimism, that you can look at this and say 7. All right, that's a challenge I'm willing to take on. So one of the things, I'm going to start by talking about children, and then I'm going to talk about institutions and sort of what we can do overall to buffer the stress. Because I think as public health, one of the things that I'm always trying to focus on is, what do we do about primary prevention, right? What do we do to really make sure that we are taking as good care as possible of the people that are under our care? Whether we can prevent their individual traumas or not, what can we do to make sure we're building resilience from the very beginning? It's much easier to raise strong children than it is to repair broken adults, right? And that's a Frederick Douglass quote. And so when we really begin to think about that, that's the importance of focusing on the children. But then I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about the things that we're doing within our institutions that could potentially be shifted to be able to better serve our communities as well. So part of what we're doing here is sort of reframing the behavior. I don't know why there is this. Okay, there we go. So part of what we're doing here is reframing the behavior, right? Part of the reason I introduced that question of, instead of saying what's wrong with you, ask what happened to you, because if we believe that people won't do something, if we decide that something is wrong with you, we go down this punitive cascade where we then become judgmental, and we decide, if we're in a school context or we're working with youth, that they are willful and defiant, right? We actually have legislation that we're working on to make sure that kids can't be suspended from school or expelled from school for being willful and defiant, right? And that's kind of the road we go down. And when we get there, we say the person's lazy, or they just want attention, or they're rude. And then we start coming up with rewards and punishment. And what we ultimately end up with is, we have some frustration, we have guilt and shame that we have when we're dealing with this child. But if we begin to say, instead of what's wrong with you, what happened to you, and we start to explore, maybe there's a reason why you can't engage in the way that I'd like you to, and maybe it's not that you don't want to, then I suddenly become curious, right? And so then I'm starting to think about what might be those barriers in place that might make it so that you are not able to engage in the way that you want to. Right? I frequently think to myself that lots of people, the people who need the most love ask for it in the most unloving ways. And so why might a reasonable person behave this way? And if I start to ask myself that question, I start to think about, what are the barriers that might be going on in your life? Because you really don't know what's going on with someone. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who is a professor at one of the local universities I won't name. But she said that, she had a student who came in really late to class one day. She was really kind of upset about it, because she had this, this policy about, if you're going to be more than 15 minutes late, get the notes from somebody else, don't come in and disrupt. And so the student came in late. And afterward, the student walked up to her and said, "My mother died this morning, and I just didn't know where else to go, so I came here. I'm really sorry I was late." And from that moment forward, she said, I realized that I don't know what's going on in people's lives. And if my classroom is a place where somebody can come and feel safe after their mother died, far be it from me to be the person who says, how dare you show up late, right? And that's just a reminder that not all circumstances are going to be that extreme, but it's a reminder to us that we don't get the full story. We meet people sometimes in the middle of something, and we don't know what's going on with them. And if we suddenly begin to judge them, we miss out on the fact that something very real may have just happened to them, and that may be why they're acting out. And so just taking a step back and really begin to think about that can help. And so I'll give you one of the sort of joking ways that I try to apply this in my life is, if I'm somewhere and I'm in a parking lot and someone cuts me off and steals my parking space, I begin to tell myself this story. Instead of saying that person is a real jerk and, they just don't have any consideration for anybody else, I take a step back and I say, I bet that person has a pregnant wife at home. and I bet she asked for pickles and ice cream, and he's just trying his best to make sure he can fulfill this need, right? It doesn't matter to me at that point. It really should not concern me what the reason is this person stole my spot, right? It's gone. I'm not going to get out the car and fight this person because they took my parking space, so I may as well move on. But it helps me to remind myself that I don't know what someone's story is, because they may just not have seen me. They may have been in a real hurry. There may be an emergency that they're trying to tend to. I don't know what's going on with them. But just making up that story in my mind helps me to reframe the interactions I have with lots of people and remind myself that, sure, I can assume that this person did this intentionally to me, or I can make a choice to think about all the things that could be going on that I'm not aware of. And so it's just a reminder to me, when those kind of things happen to me, the stories that we tell ourselves take us down a very different path about how we feel about people and how we engage with them. And so if we think about it from a barrier perspective, then we can start thinking about what can we do to get some of these barriers out of their way? And then we then begin to support, and that child can feel strengthened. And so that's the ultimate goal, is that when we're thinking about building resilience, is how do we engage with people in a way that actually helps to build them up instead of tear them down and punish them? So the resilience themes, right? And there are actually quite a few of them. And we think about these 6 domains of resilience. The first one is vision, right? Feeling a sense of purpose, having goals, and having some congruence between sort of what you're experiencing and the likelihood of achieving your goals. Composure is another one, right? The ability to regulate your own emotions and be able to calm yourself and feel like you are in control of your responses to things. Reasoning is another one of our resilience themes. And this is where we get into problem solving, being able to anticipate and plan, being able to better understand what's happening. And then we have the health one, right? Which is that nutrition, sleep, exercise. You know, the best example of this is that Snickers commercial, right? You're not you when you're hungry. That is incredibly true, that none of us work our best when we're sleep deprived, when we haven't moved, right? And when we're hungry. And sometimes my husband will say to me, is this a real problem or did you skip lunch? And it's just been about as I'm about to, chew his head off. I'm like, I did skip lunch. Let me eat. And then I'm going to think about whether or not I'm still upset about this thing that I'm snapping about, right? But it's true. Like, we are human beings, and we don't work well when we're not fueled and when we're not rested. And so that can exacerbate some of our underlying trauma symptoms when we're already not at our physical best. And then tenacity, right? So our persistence, our realistic optimism, and our ability to bounce back from things is incredibly important. And then also collaboration. So do we have support networks? Is there a way that we can team up with other people and have the ability to be able to feel those connections? And so those are the 6 domains of resilience. So let's think about how some of these can play out in the work that we do. So when we think about vision, this is where we start to talk about the purpose, the goals, and the congruence. And so when we're working with youth, one of the big things to think about is setting expectations, right? And one of the best ways we can do that is to develop ground rules. So when I talk to people who are doing youth development work and youth programming, or even in schools, one of the things we talk about is, at the very beginning of the year, setting ground rules. How are we going to engage in this space? What are the things? And co-creating those, whether you're dealing with kindergartners or whether you're dealing with high school seniors. You can always co-create rules. And then you can talk about why we should have those rules, and what we can expect when we follow those rules, and what we can expect when we don't. And that way, everybody has an agreement around what this space is supposed to look like, and how we're going to engage in it, and how we're going to respond if you don't engage in that. And that, for people who've experienced trauma, and one of the disrupting things about trauma is the way that it's unpredictable in many ways. And that can be very disconcerting, because then it puts you on high alert for, when is this additional trauma going to happen? And there's something really reassuring about coming into a space and knowing, A, what is expected of you, B, what's going to happen if you follow those expectations, and C, even if somebody doesn't follow those expectations, you still know what is going to happen. That can be incredibly calming to our limbic systems. And so if you think about it from that perspective, this is one way that we can be trauma informed in approaching a space, by both setting a vision for people and allowing them to have some goals, but then also being able to make sure that there's congruence between those goals and how we engage in that space. And so establishing routines is a key part of that. The next one is collaboration, right? And so if we think about this, establishing a support network, one of the big things that can happen, again, is making sure that there's consistency and connectivity among kids, that there's not just one-offs, but there are people who are in their lives in a support network, not just an individual. We'll talk about that in a moment, but having actual support networks that exist, that can be relied upon for a consistent support. And so this means, I often use as the example our foster youth, because they are some of the ones who we know have an ACE score of at least 1, right? Because they have been separated from their parents. And likely for some of the other ACEs, so we can probably guess that they have ACE scores somewhere at least at 3 or 4, if not higher. And so when we're thinking about them, if you're being taken away from your family, having a consistent school placement, being able to stay in your, in your after school group, or being able to stay connected with your sports team, those things are incredibly important, because the other parts of your life that are often the stabilizing forces have changed. And so finding some ways to be able to build consistency is incredibly important for being able to maintain those connections and receive that social support. Another one is making sure that people have accessible transportation that's not burdensome, right? So again, if we keep you at the same school, but we make you catch 7 buses to get there and back, that's not really accessible. And so what are the ways in which we can think about how transportation can be, again, one of the sort of soothing or healing opportunities throughout someone's day? I mentioned extracurricular involvement, keeping that constant. And then the other thing is sometimes creating a youth alliance. I always like to tell my own personal story that when I was almost 12, my father had congestive heart failure, and I did not know this. And while we were out to dinner for my aunt's birthday, he dropped dead at the table. And so I was almost 12. And so you can imagine the trauma and devastation of thinking that you're about to have dinner and having your dad die. And so what ended up happening was, when I got back to school after the funeral and probably a few days, at home with my family, that I was put into a grief counseling program at my public school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with about 4 other kids in the school who had lost. One had lost her brother, one had lost an aunt that she was very close with to cancer, one had lost her mother. And so we were all in this group together, and we were going through this together. And it was really great to be able to go through all of the stages of grief and be able to stay connected. And thanks to Facebook, now, decades later, we are still connected, and we still will check in on each other. And I'll say, hey, how are you doing? I know this is the anniversary of your brother's death. How are you feeling today? That sense of support has maintained throughout our lives, because we were all experiencing something similar at that time. And there was a youth alliance that was created for us to be able to support one another. And I can't emphasize how important it is for especially youth to recognize they are not the only ones in the world going through this thing, and to feel seen and to feel heard and to feel supported. So this is one of the ones that when I talk about a support network, I am the beneficiary of that. And I really think it's important that we think about the ways in which we create that in whatever space we're in. And then there's tenacity, right? And so tenacity is that realistic optimism, that ability to bounce back. And part of that can be built by having someone in your life who is really consistent, but in a mentor relationship. So we talked a little bit about the support network, and that can be peer, that can be part of a community, that can look a lot of different ways. But when we're thinking about the building of tenacity, it's that support network, but it's really having that mentor-mentee relationship. It can be, so you really want to identify or develop a trusted relationship. And I say develop because there are some kids who may come without that tether to a family network, and you want to make sure that they get somebody in their life who has this. We have entire programs like Big Brothers Big Sisters that are dedicated to making sure that every child has an opportunity to have a relationship like this with somebody who can be an older mentor and be there for them and be special to them, and they can be special in return. And so for this, we can think about this being a teacher, it can be a community member, it can be an older student, it can be a parent for many people. But if we're working in a school setting or somewhere else, you may want to think about identifying someone or helping to build another relationship, because we know that the parent relationship can sometimes be fraught because of the discipline part, right? And so if somebody's struggling with something or having the calling of a parent to be able to come in and that being your support person, sometimes can also then conflate that with a punitive a consequence, and that's not what we want. We really want this to be someone where difficult conversations, uncomfortable conversations, that there can be an opportunity to really be able to have those, and for this person to feel supported. And so when you're working with youth, one of the things that can be really important is to ask them, who do you trust, and why do you trust this person, and how does this person make you feel, and on a difficult day, would it help to talk to this person? And the reason why is that we often will see youth have a bad day, and we're not sure what to do other than to, set them aside or maybe try to provide some comfort. But if we know up front who they trust, and we know how that person makes them feel, we can offer that as a way to be able to help them to deal with a day where they may be triggered. The other reason for this is it's really helpful. A lot of times we don't recognize the youth in our lives who are really looking up to us. And so it can be helpful to prime these adults for future contact and say, you know, you don't know it, but little Ruby thinks the world of you and is hanging on your every word. So when you see her, it just gives you a heightened awareness that this person really cares about what you're thinking. And so when you're interacting with them, that every single thing you say can be incredibly important, or don't say can be incredibly important. And so to be mindful of that and to really honor and respect that relationship. And so helping to cultivate that relationship can be very important in terms of making sure that you feel supported and are able to build that tenacity, right? That ability to feel like the relationships I have are not conditional. And so I can bounce back from things. There's somebody who will help me through difficult times, who will support me, and whose relationship to me is not based on what I have to give them or how I perform or who I am to them, but it's based on some inherent quality of my own worth. And then composure. So this is where we begin to talk about calm and control. And so one of the big things that has to be built here is that we have to recognize that trauma-informed does not mean that, you know, inappropriate behaviors don't have consequences. But it does mean that we move away from this traditional kind of way of thinking, which is that we are either punitive or we're permissive, right? You are either laying down the law and putting the smack down, or you are a doormat, and there's nothing in between. And that's actually not true. That when we think about, you know, having a restorative discipline, it's really a partnership. And so it really is about, you know, valuing the nurturing, the encouragement, the expectations, setting limits, and having accountability. And if you go back to those 14 resilience factors, you know, there were expectations and I was held accountable for them is one of those resilience factors. So it's not a matter of letting people get away with anything because poor Johnny has had a really hard life. It's a matter of making sure that Johnny understands that there are expectations and that you care enough to hold them to those expectations. And so that means that inappropriate behaviors have to have consequences, but those consequences don't have to inflict trauma. And so what that means is that in the process of addressing them, we should be modeling the desired behavior, right? There's nothing more hypocritical than yelling, "Stop yelling!" You know, like that doesn't quite make sense, right? Because we are actually not modeling this desired behavior. And the question becomes, well, first of all, how is that going to help? One person starts to yell, everybody starts to yell. But also, like, why is it appropriate for you to be yelling in this circumstance and not me? And then you also want to be repairing the harm that's caused by whatever that behavior is. So thinking about what do we do to get back to where we wanted to be. And sometimes that means that we need to think about, you know, teaching lessons and being sort of proportional in our response. That means that everything should not involve, you know, calling a parent or involving, you know, a principal or some sort of additional punishment. It could be that a reminder is all that's really needed for restore. It's like, you know, a reminder we don't do that, or a reminder, you know, you may have taken somebody else's. Can you return that to them? A reminder of what those rules are and what the expectations are, and bringing them back into the classroom or into the youth setting or wherever you're working. And they should be mutually agreed upon. And that kind of goes back to setting the ground rules. Like, it is completely unfair if I were to walk in here today and give all of you an exam when we didn't talk about that in advance, you're not prepared, and you don't know what was expected, right? That would not be fair. And the same thing is true here, that people need to have the expectations communicated in order to hold them accountable for that. So it's all a part of a process when we're dealing with youth in particular and thinking about how to handle these things in context. And then, of course, composure. One of the things that we know is that it is very difficult for people to identify their feelings, right? And part of that is because socially, it's not always acceptable to talk about how you're feeling. And then we also have the gender lens of it's not okay for, you know, for boys sometimes to feel sad or to cry. Like, we constrain people's ability to be able to share their emotions. And so the lack of language and the lack of acceptable expression of our emotions can make it so that when we are experiencing trauma, we have to then sort of express how we're feeling in these really constrained ways, and it sometimes blows up, or we have to repress our feelings in general. And so part of what we need to do is, in order for people to maintain composure, they need to be able to identify their emotions first, so then they can figure out when they're feeling certain ways and how to regulate those feelings. And so part of that is from a young age, whether it's the feelings wheel on the left or the feelings wheel on the right, we need to start to help people identify those feelings, why they're feeling that way, and what may have caused it, and what they can do to feel a different way if that feeling is not desired. And that, again, is part of letting people recognize that all of these are acceptable emotions, but that we then can't allow them to control some of our behaviors. And so what are we feeling? How does that relate to our behavior? And what can we do to be able to change some of our behaviors in response to these feelings? And then lastly, thinking about reasoning, right? So problem solving. So when we're going through this process of, restorative discipline, and when we're thinking about, how someone is identifying their feelings, part of what we need to do is walk them through when there's a conflict or something that has happened, an incident, asking what happened? How did it happen? What part did you play in it? How were you affected by what you did? So often we focus on how someone else was affected by someone's behavior, that we don't even think about the fact that anytime you have an interaction with anyone, both people have an effect. That effect can be neutral, that effect can be positive, that effect can be negative. And so allowing people to have some introspection and how were you affected? Who else was affected? What do you need to do to make it right? And what can you do to repair the harm? And those are some of the ways where we can really begin to start talking about problem solving. And for youth to be able to see that they have a role in shaping the world around them and shaping the relationships that they have, and being able to better understand how to both regulate those feelings and also identify ways to be able to turn those feelings into future actions. So that's sort of a focus on what we can do when we're working in particular with youth and thinking about, the ways that trauma show up and the ways that we can preempt and respond to some of those trauma symptoms. And the nice thing is that they're good for everyone, right? So even if you haven't experienced trauma, it's good to set ground rules. And it's good to be thinking about, identifying feelings. All of these are all part of healthy development, but they're especially important if you've experienced a trauma, because they can have an additional resilience building factor for someone who needs it as a way to be able to get back to tolerable stress. But now we have to think about our institutions, because many of us work within institutions, and those institutions have their own sort of history. And so if we're thinking about organizations, they can either be trauma organized, trauma informed, or healing. And we ultimately want to try to build healing organizations. And the real differences here are that trauma organized spaces are reactive, right? They often are retelling and reliving some of the trauma that has happened. They avoid difficult conversations altogether and just do not engage in those. There often can be this sort of tribalism, this us versus them that kind of happens within them. They often perpetuate inequities, and there's oftentimes authoritarian leadership. And so being in a space like that is often trauma organized. It means that trauma is allowed to thrive in those organizations. And if we're thinking about the role that both people are bringing in terms of their own history and context to the space, and then also the history and context of the organization, as we think about it from that, where are the sources of trauma, this is just a great place. It's like a petri dish for trauma to just begin to take over and be the way that we are engaging with one another. When we then think about trauma informed, that's sort of a first step, right? It's sort of understanding the nature of trauma and recovery, and beginning to think about some of the ways that we can move in a direction together. So we're starting to have now shared language, we're starting to have now shared understanding and shared trainings, and we're really kind of beginning to recognize some of the structural issues related to trauma as they relate to the people working within our organization and the way our organization is functioning. But the goal here, the prize, is to get to being a healing organization, one that is truly reflective, one that is thinking about having relational leadership, right? So not authoritarian, but really building those relationships and valuing relationships, one that has equity and accountability, one that is really thinking about growth and prevention, and one that is making meaning out of the past. And that may mean going back and recognizing that the way that the organization has functioned in the past has caused harm, and thinking about what you can do to engage in a restorative justice process to be able to address that. And those are healing organizations. And so you can look at this and think about the many organizations that you interface with in your life and where they might be in this process. And then begin to think about what are the things that we can do to usher them out of, if they're earlier on, to get them to the place where they're healing organizations. So part of this is thinking about data-driven improvements, right? So it's helpful to be able to recognize where you are. If you're looking at that list and you're like, I'm not totally sure, it may be helpful to think about what has happened in your organization. How is your history impacting your workforce or your quality of services now? These are all reflective questions that are important for organizations to ask ourselves. Are you trauma organized? Are you trauma informed? Or are you healing? And where will safety and healing fall into your organizational priorities? All of these things are incredibly important for us to better understand. And if we don't, we're doomed to sort of repeat the same patterns that have been there. So this is an iterative process. It's the first step in thinking about what we can do about trauma. So the process really is often leadership engagement, because the people who often hold power, especially in trauma organized institutions that are under sort of authoritarian leadership, are the people who are in those formal leadership positions. So if they don't buy in, and if they don't, mobilize resources, and those resources can be time of staff, that can be the bully pulpit of just being the leaders of the organization, and it can also be the money that's needed to be able to organize trainings and to be able to think about this together. Oftentimes, some of this groundwork doesn't get off the ground and doesn't take hold in an organization. So really, leadership engagement can be a first step. And then we move to that part where we're, trauma informed. And so we're doing trauma training. And we're now thinking about how do we allocate resources so that we can institutionalize some of the ideas that we've come up with in terms of shaping an organization. And then how do we change policy and practice on a formal level? How do we bake this in so this is just not what our organization does, but who our organization is? And then how do we evaluate it and engage in this continuous quality improvement process to make sure that we're constantly going back and looking at this, because new things may come up. And I always think about the goal of making progress on any domain that we're moving forward on is always that the next generation has a different set of problems to deal with than this one does, right? It's not that we're never going to be without problems or without ways that we can improve, but it's hopefully that we're not trying to solve the same problem for 10 millennia, right? That the goal is that over time we get better, right? And so you have a different set of problems that you're dealing with, because hopefully we have solved some of the ones we were working on, and now new ones have cropped up that we have to be innovative and think about how to handle. So I mentioned this before. So one of the things that we want to do when we're engaging within an organization is really assuming positive intent, right? Changing that frame is incredibly important. And it's one of the things that we always have to do within an organization. And so I love to remind people, and that's why I will say it several times, that behavior does not always align with intent. And so when we think about engaging with people, we have to remind ourselves of the question, why would a reasonable person behave this way? And if a reasonable person wouldn't behave this way, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is happening here that may be causing a disconnect between the way that somebody who's being reasonable would behave and someone who maybe is experiencing trauma or something else going on is behaving? And so being able to link those up is important in terms of changing the frame and the approach that we have to the things that are happening within interpersonal relationships and within an organization. The next one that's incredibly important when we're doing work, especially in communities, is to learn the story. So often we come in and we have our bright, shiny intervention and we don't recognize the context. And this is incredibly important for adverse community experiences, that communities have a history. And not only do they have a history, but they are actively every day writing new pages in their story. And so if you are coming into a community that you're not a part of and you have not done the reading, as we all think about from seminars and school classes, right? If you haven't done the reading, you're unprepared to come in and begin to engage in that conversation and begin to do your work. And so this is a first step, is learning the story, learning the history, because then you can help to really begin to recognize and preempt some of the access barriers, some of the concerns, some of the fears, some of the mistrust, some of the questions, and even some of the misconceptions. And this really is, about learning compassion and not stereotyping. So we should not come in with preconceived notions about who a community is. We need to learn to come in and value the expertise, the lived experience that people have, and how that's central to the work that we do. And so that's really shifting of a mindset about who is the expert, and shifting it from the expert is the person with the academic or the professional title to the expert is the person who has information that is of value. And that should mean that everybody coming to the table is going to be an expert in something. It's just going to be from a different vantage point. Then, as an organization, we have to really think about what are some of the things that may already be happening in a community that we want to avoid. And so especially when we're thinking about service provision, I always like to bring this one up, because this can really create trauma in a community, right? So if somebody is coming in and they suddenly get a little loud or do something that's not violent, that's not putting your staff at risk, there is a time to call the police, certainly. But there also is a lot, and we've seen lots of headlines lately where we have called the police, in particular on communities of color, when they were just living their lives. And that can be a very dangerous proposition, but it's also layering it on top of the history, again, knowing the story of what's happened in communities, that for communities of color, from our Asian community, thinking about the Chinese Exclusion Act to, Jim Crow laws and lynching and all those things, the history of policing in a lot of communities in the United States is not a positive one. It's not one that is rife with trust. And it's not one where people are happy to see the police show up. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Get Out, but the first time you saw it and the police car pulled up at the very end of the movie, everybody had the same sinking feeling of, oh shoot, what's going to happen? I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't seen it. It's a brilliant film, but I will just say it's not what you think. But that's the feeling you have when you see that police car drive up, because of the understanding of that story and history. And so I bring this up because often when we're doing work, we sometimes view police as being, and peace officers as being, part of public safety, but calling them into certain communities to handle, even if it's a minor scuffle, even if you've had positive relationships with the police and all of that, it can certainly escalate a situation and can create trauma. And so when we're thinking about how we're engaging with communities and doing community work, we need to be mindful of this history and mindful of the fear that this can inflict in communities, and be really, really cautious and conscious of how this particular tool is used, because it is not necessarily one that is going to be trauma informed depending on where you're working. The next thing that we need to think about from an organizational perspective is, how do we hire from within communities? So I bring this up because one of the things that happens when we think about adverse community experience and we think about the history, especially of racism as a community trauma, is that we often have a colonial mindset to the way that we do work, right? And I mean that in the most candid way possible, which is that we go out and we hire a bunch of people who are super credentialed and have all of this academic, experience. And then we realize that one of the critical success factors to our program is community engagement. And so we go out to communities and we say, will you for free go out and tell all your friends to come and sign up for these services or join this program or whatever else. And we give you no money for that, but yet the whole crux of this program relies on this free labor that I just asked you to provide for this, because I'm being paid and I'm on a salary, but my program is not successful at all unless I find somebody for free to go out and do all this recruiting work for us. And so a lot of times that happens because of the ways that we have constructed our job requirements, right? We are looking for people who have all of this, all of these degrees and all of this experience in really formal settings. And yet our program is actually a community-based program, or our program requires something else. And so sometimes we need to take a step back and look at, do we need this particular title in order to be able to work this program? Or do we need a different type of expertise and experience? And if so, how do we write that in? How do we institutionalize that so that we're not just hiring people from outside of a community, but we're actually hiring them from within? And my best example of this is, there is a teen prevention program that I will not name. I love to tell stories, but let the guilty remain unnamed. But there was a teen pregnancy prevention program, and there was so in this program, in certain communities, the majority of the people who were engaging in this program were Latina. And so there was a woman who had actually been a teen mom herself, and had, several degrees, was from one of the communities and was applying for this job. And the job was actually given to somebody who had more formal experience, who had majored in Spanish in a school in the Midwest, and was white and was not from the community at all, and didn't know much about the community. And, for this is a teen pregnancy program, right, to support pregnant and parenting teens. And this person was, married, having her first baby in her 30s, and not at all having this experience, right? And so, but because of the way that the job description was written, this was the most qualified candidate. Even though you had this other person over here who not only had lived experience, but had cultural competence, spoke the language natively, was from the community, was involved in the churches, was all of these things that you would think, wow, this brings a lot to the table. But because of the way the job description was written, this is the person who gets the job. And so we really have to think about what role that plays in terms of having outside people coming into a community, and who gets the job. And so this goes to the structure, right, of how we do these things. And sometimes we've always done it that way, and that's why we continue to operate in that way. But it takes a critical lens to step back and say, should we be doing it this way? And is it going to be more helpful to our communities in terms of building resilience if all of these young women who are in the program can see somebody who looks like them, who's been in their shoes, to see as a person they can look up to, that was able to figure out how to now become the person doing this work and living the life with their child who is now an adult and thriving in all of these other circumstances, right? That is a really powerful message, and it's overlooked if we only think about it from the way we've always done it. And so this is a concept called mistaking the mirror for merit. And what it means is that if there's a way we've always done things and there are people who are like us, we are more likely to see them as deserving. And so if we layer that on top of the existing power dynamics, who is seen as deserving, who is seen as hardworking, and who is seen as worthwhile or even worthy of certain positions versus the way that we frame others. And if we're aware of it, we're in a position to better be able to navigate around it. And then, of course, there's the establishing culture, right? When we talked about those healing organizations, the big thing is to continue the conversation and the learning, right? Making sure that we have shared language around what does trauma look like in communities? What does trauma look like in families? How are the ways that we can really think about this? What are some of the biases that we may be bringing to the table, especially as it relates to certain communities? And these biases are not just racial or gender biases. We also may have biases against people who have different abilities, people who are showcasing some of our trauma symptoms, right? The very people that we want to engage and most need our assistance are sometimes the people who are least equipped to navigate our systems and the ones we are least patient with or least accommodating of. And so really beginning to learn to navigate some of our biases can be helpful in making sure that the work that we do is impactful. And so some of this can be really beginning, as we establish culture, is having some ways that we can do some joint learning and make sure that everybody is kind of grappling with the same issues at the same time and can provide support. And the big thing about that is that nobody is an expert. If there is one term that irritates me the most that we use all the time, it's cultural competency. Because A, it makes it seem like certain people are competent and know everything about culture, and other people are culturally incompetent. When really what we're talking about is cultural sensitivity and cultural humility. We're talking about the idea that I may know my very particular cultural context very well, but I may not know a lot of other cultures very well. And so I need to be sensitive to the things I don't know, and I need to defer to people who do know them well, and I need to be respectful of that culture. That's what we're going for. Not that we're all suddenly going to be competent and know it all. That is from an outside perspective, that can feel incredibly paternalistic, that now you think you're competent in my culture. You're not a part of my culture. You don't know that. But you want to be as sensitive and respectful. And so these are some of the ways that we can think about how to do that from many different domains. And we talked a lot about intersectionality last time in terms of our identities. That's incredibly important when we think about establishing culture and beginning to learn these things and grapple with them together so everybody can learn and everybody can move forward as an organization. So then the next step, and I always like to leave you with this, is that continuous quality improvement process, right? When we're thinking about how we engage with youth, when we're thinking about how we engage in organizations and some of the structural and organizational things that we want to do so that we have better organizations that are doing better work and we're providing better services overall, is thinking about the stop, start, continue. So what are you currently doing that you're going to stop? Because it just isn't working, right? It's not trauma informed. This is not a way that we want to organize our work and our space and our organization. What is something that you haven't done that you're going to start doing because it may work, right? What is that new innovation? What is the thing that you've heard or learned or been toying around with for a while that you finally feel like you have the impetus to be able to say, I want to try this because I want to see how this is going to work. There's some good data behind it. There's some good understanding behind it. And this is really either an evidence-informed practice or a promising practice that based on what we know about some other things could work and I should try this out. And then to recognize that, even within some of our trauma organized, institutions, that there still are things that we're doing right? The saying, there's a broke clock is right twice a day. Like there still are things, even if there's some major dysfunction within your organization, there are going to be things that you get right and that you do well. And so what are some of those things that we're definitely going to continue? And I think many of you are working in organizations where lots of things, 80-90% of the things that you're doing are really, really positive and that you want to continue. And so to make sure you highlight those and say, great, we're going to continue on this path because this is working. And now I actually have some data and a framework to be able to explain why that's working. Like many of you probably who work with youth already have been setting ground rules and doing some of those things. And now you have an additional impetus for why that works and sort of an additional rationale for continuing that process if you get to the place where we Okay. All right, we are back up. Yes. Great. Are there any questions? And please make sure we get the chat feature online as well. I see a hand in the back. Hi. Thank you. Now my leg can stop shaking. Sure, absolutely. So, and I'm going to direct you to a resource while also talking about it. So, Prevention Institute has published. Oh, sorry. Yes, I forgot that quickly. Repeating the question. The question was, can I talk a little bit more about the other type of ACEs, the adverse community experiences, and is it a 10-question survey? And what are the domains and frameworks for that? And so the answer to that is that I'm going to direct you to a resource, which is Prevention Institute. They have an adverse community experiences primer that's published on their website, and it's written by Howard Pinderhughes and Maisha Williams. And it's a great overview of sort of what's happening in communities and how they're thinking about it. And they actually have a really great infographic that will kind of walk you through some of the tenets of it. The way that we, and when I say we, I'm talking about now public health advocates, one of the ways that we are thinking about adverse community experiences is thinking about those natural disasters, thinking about the ways in which communities may experience social oppression. And so that's like vilification of identity and sort of the tenets of racism that may exist in the way that a community is viewed. So we're separating that out from individual acts of racism, but really sort of the way that a community is viewed within their broader social context. Then we also think about the concentration of poverty and what that looks like in terms of what a community has in terms of tangible resources, experiences of violence, and then the fracturing of social networks that occur because of displacement or homelessness, et cetera. So that's those are like the 4 domains that we use to be able to operationalize, which is essentially to measure adverse community experiences. The website, it's the Prevention Institute. They're one of our really trusted partners. And the document is written by Howard Pinderhughes and Maisha Williams, and it's on adverse community experiences. I think that's the most accessible one. It's like a really good primer on it, and there's good info. Like if you want to take this and then have a conversation with other people, it's great. There are lots of people who are beginning to think about this work, but they've really done a good job of kind of bringing it all together and thinking about how this works and how it relates to adverse childhood experiences. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, I'd be happy to do that. I won't make you go to the Googles. Ooh, okay. So the question is directed towards the local community, and is there any movement in getting the ACEs screening in any of the local clinics or hospitals? I think there are 2 of us who maybe can answer this question. Some of you may be aware that we have a brand new Surgeon General. That's Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who was in the video that you saw before I started speaking. And so one of the things when that office was established of the California Surgeon General, that office is tasked with adverse childhood experiences and sort of screening for and addressing adverse childhood experiences, and then also addressing social determinants of health. And so in the governor's budget for 2019 was, I believe it's $45 million for screening of ACEs. And so that's something that potentially is going to happen statewide, depending on whether or not that money stays in after we go through the sausage making process of the Assembly and Senate and the governor are reconciling all of their different budgets. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Dr. Arambula, who is the assembly member from Fresno. In 2017, he passed AB 340, which was looking at screening for adverse childhood experiences. And so one of the things that the goal there was to be able to do universal screening and early detection and intervention. And so they convened a group of experts to look at screening tools and really identify the most comprehensive one. And so they are supposed to have their findings out, I believe it is next month based on statute. And and they've been meeting all of this time. So there's actually a place you can go on, I believe it's the Department of Healthcare Services website, where you can look at the AB 340 committee and actually see where they are in the process and what they've reviewed already, and how close they are to having sort of a final recommendation. And I bring that up because my understanding is that the findings from that committee are going to largely be what will be used to then roll out any sort of universal screening protocol and that sort of thing that would come along with the new budget line item if it's approved. So right now, the answer is things are in the pipeline, and you'll know more when the budget gets passed in a couple of months. But yes, there are some things that from the state perspective that would certainly have an impact locally. And then I will defer to some of the locals to talk about what may be happening specifically here in Napa.
So in Napa, we have actually through the Resilient Napa project, we have a group that we've met with once of local healthcare providers and looking at how we might roll that out here in our community and how the different healthcare organizations are looking internally at how they might use screening. So it's a very preliminary process, and Dr. Koffer's explanation of all of the different resources and what's happening on a state level is something that we're watching locally to kind of see where then we can go. But it's a really large process. And I think the point that you brought up earlier of it's important to do the ACE screening, and that provides information, but just as important is to do the resiliency screening to show what assets you bring to the table. And then that's the conversation that's important to kind of move forward and have hope.
And to be clear, some of the considerations that the AB 340 committee are currently grappling with are, okay, so if we go and we do this screening, is there now mandatory reporting for the things that we screened for, right? And what then does that do in terms of people's willingness to be screened and willingness to be honest in the screen? And so one of the things that the Center for Youth Wellness, where Dr. Burke Harris worked before she became the Surgeon General, one of the things they did was when they did the screen, all that was reported back to them was the score. So they didn't actually know what particular things were you screened positive for. All they knew was sort of if you had a score in a range of, more than 6, 4 or 5, 1 to 3 and 0. And so that was their way of sort of getting around now we have to report that you said this, that, and the other happened to you or your child, that kind of thing. The other thing that's really important, and one of the reasons why one of the things the committee is grappling with is how to include what we're calling expanded ACEs, right? Because the original study was done in a population that was predominantly white, that was incredibly affluent, right? So the majority of the people in the study were college educated. None of them were on Medi-Cal, right? 60% of our state population is on Medi-Cal. None of them were on Medi-Cal because they were in Kaiser in 1998 before Kaiser had Medi-Cal patients, because this is before Obamacare, right? And so because of that, this was a really skewed population. And so there were things that just weren't asked. And some of those were, are you in foster care? Right. We asked about parental incarceration. We don't ask about juvenile justice involvement. There are all these things that we have good data on that are also adverse childhood experiences that are not in the original study. And so there's been a lot of additional work that people have done piloting some of those other measures as a way to be able to add them in. And so part of what the group is grappling with is sort of what's the best way to identify this and what's the best way to screen for this in a clinical setting so that we are able to screen the most people without having, potentially, criminal justice involvement or social service involvement. How can we do this in a way that we can then train pediatricians and family physicians to be able to do in everything from, a rural setting to an urban setting to an emergency setting to a chronic care setting. Like, how do we make this something that can be used in a widespread fashion, and then train providers on how they're supposed to use it and what the next steps are. And so that's where all of this work comes in. It's not just a matter of like, let's pick a screening tool here, everybody go for it. It's like, how do we make sure that we roll this thing out in a really appropriate fashion? And even though I'm less concerned about some of the things than other people are, I still recognize the concerns. And the reason for that is that we do have good data that when we've screened, at least in adults and in some of the clinical populations, that we haven't seen some of the devastating consequences that we thought. For years, we were required in some of the places that we're screening to actually have licensed therapists on hand so that if people were screening, we actually had a way for them to be able to deal with maybe the fallout of screening positively. And over time, nobody really used that because what we learned is that you're not actually giving people new information, right? This isn't the same thing as like screening for someone for HIV and then telling them you have HIV. This is something that they're telling you that they already knew. And so in many instances, people felt more relieved that this was a thing and that this explained some of the other things they were experiencing than they felt like they were getting new information that was devastating to them. But part of the concern we have about this is because we put all this money into screening for breast and cervical cancer, and at the time we didn't think through what it would mean to tell women you have breast or cervical cancer. And so we did all this screening, and the women were like, I don't have insurance. What do you mean I have breast cancer? And we were like, sorry. I was just told to screen you. I don't know what we're supposed to do about it, right? And that was devastating. And so we realized we shouldn't do that in the future. But now we're sort of realizing that not every situation is telling somebody they have cancer or telling somebody they have HIV. That some of this is actually really different because they're really telling us something that they've always known, and now we know as the provider. And so what does that look like in terms of necessary follow-up and referral, et cetera?
So I appreciate what you just said, because my underlying concern has been that, you know, oh, I can even, you don't have to repeat this. And just that underlying, yeah, because it's going to be a lot of words. So that, they all know me. Underlying concern about let's do universal screening and not have any place to respond to that, for either from interventions or even from this sort of conceptual framework that you've just laid out. This is the first time I've heard that statement that you made beyond the, yeah, we're just going to screen everybody. So I guess I'm still looking for some way to understand that it's there's a process there and not just Dr. Burke-Harris is going to promote universal screening. We're all going to be really happy that everybody knows their ACE score.
Yes, and that is the goal of the AB 340 committee and some of the other work that's happening right now. There also is a bill, AB 656, which is going to establish the Office of Safe and Healthy Communities. And my understanding of how that bill is written, and my state policy director, who just hired a couple months ago, knows the details of that bill a lot better than I do now. Thanks to 15. My understanding of that bill is that part of what they're going to be looking at is sort of what are those supports that when we're thinking about violence, when we're thinking about, you know, adverse community experience, and when we're thinking about adverse childhood experiences, what are the ways in which we can provide additional supports to people afterward? And so there is a lot of work happening right now kind of concurrently to make sure all of these systems will be in place so that we're not just screening people and then telling them, great, your ACE score is 10, good luck. We have learned, we have definitely learned.
So the next question that we'd like to take, we actually had a question from Contra Costa.
Okay.
So
Contra Costa.
if you would like to go ahead and unmute Blanca, we'd love to hear your question.
You're talking, we can't hear you.
I think she's still working on it.
I frequently talk into a muted microphone, so I like to tell people.
What we can do too is we can share that webcam.
Oh.
That might be cool, theoretically. Hey there, Blanca. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and leave you unmuted so that if you have an opportunity to check the audio on your side, we'll go ahead and read the questions aloud here in the room. Bryn can go ahead and do that.
So, oh yeah.
So the question we had from the audience in Contra Costa was, is there a revised version of the ACEs questionnaire that we can all get a hold of?
So there are quite a few ACEs questionnaires, and so I would again direct you to the AB 340 committee, because they've been kind of going over the different screening tools that are available and been doing some head-to-head comparisons of them. There is not like one sort of accepted tool. There is the original ACEs screener, which was done with 17,000 people, and so that's the one that kind of many people have started with. And then there are the ones that people have piloted in other communities, and so there are kind of pros and cons of using any of them, including the original one. So I would, again, direct you to the AB 340 committee's webpage, which is on the Department of Healthcare Services website. And that will then be able to allow you to kind of delve into that conversation and look at some of the screening tools that are under consideration. And also, ACEs Connection has lots of screening tools available as well on the website. So that's another place to go to look at different tools that are being used in different settings.
Thank you. No, that was the only question.
Okay. That was the only question for now.
I have a question. Do they have another question? Okay. I have a question. So in our community, one of the issues that we're dealing with, like many communities, is kind of the issues of inequity between different cultures. And of recent, like many communities, the immigrant community has had to deal with a lot of adverse community experiences around fear. And so a lot of the work that we're doing here is trying to reach out to those communities and engage them on how we can best support them, and also bring them in to the conversation. And so I really appreciate the framing that you provided around not cultural competency, but cultural sensitivity. And so recently we had an experience where someone had hacked into road signs and put things that were derogatory, like build the wall, and then there was other stuff around women, beware of women drivers and things like that. So it's kind of been out on social media. And so I just share that as like the context of one example. So what is your suggestion in terms of how to best engage those communities as we're starting to look at doing outreach around issues around voter registration and engagement, around census? Yeah, exactly. Around the issues around public charge and the changes there, and connecting those two different groups.
Yes, that is a major concern, especially in places like California, where we have very diverse populations, and in particular, as we're thinking about our immigrant population, there are a lot of people who came out as part of the DACA process, and then are now feeling a sense of fear because their disclosure of all of this information about themselves now has the potential to be weaponized against them and their families. And so it's a really unfortunate position to be in, because what has ended up happening is that even in communities where there are sanctuary cities and we're sanctuary state and all of that there still is this fear that I don't want to sign up for necessary services because I don't want anybody to be able to then have access to those records and be able to know. So I think part of what has to happen, and that kind of goes back to that slide I was talking about, understanding the story and history of the community, and then recognizing what the misconceptions are. Because the truth is that within California, there are lots of ways in which people can be protected. And there's certain organizations that just by process will not share information about these things, or will not ask information about these things. There are ways in which people don't have to share all of their information, like they don't have to put down where they live to be able to access services. And so it's really important that for people who have access to that information, that they're partnering with community-based organizations. I can't stress enough the community health workers and the promotoras, the role that they can play in terms of disseminate. They're trusted people in the community, and they can disseminate information in ways that people can trust about, look, if you go here, here are your rights. Here's what you're allowed to share. Here's what you don't have to share with anyone. This is the truth, and these are the misconceptions. So yes, be worried about this, but don't be worried about that kind of thing. And I know when they were asking about the citizenship question on the census, that was a big deal. I know our organization came out against it. It said very strongly that this is not something that we need to ask for the census because it's going to significantly hamper our ability to have a complete census, which is kind of the point. And so, but even just teasing those ideas creates a culture of fear. And then once people hear that message, you now have to work 7 times as hard to be able to undo the message. And so part of that is you have to figure out how we're going to do that work and what our mass education campaigns are to be able to make sure that people have accurate information and not misconceptions based on what was tweeted or what was rumored or what was proposed but didn't actually come into fruition. And how that differs from the way we actually are operating. Because California does operate differently than a lot of other states do. And so sometimes, especially because families have, folks across state lines, something that could take place in Georgia might not be allowed. So that's going to be a really challenging thing. And just recognizing all the ways that when we were talking about criminalization, that's one of the big things is like interfacing with law enforcement. And so one of the things I actually had a sort of public service announcement on my own personal Facebook page recently about, the legalization of marijuana in California and how we have to recognize that this is still a federal crime, even though it's legal for adults in California. So people need to, especially people who may be undocumented or maybe in other precarious situations, really need to think a lot about how much you advertise your personal use of a product that's still federally illegal on social media and in public and wherever else. Because while our federal administration has not cracked down in states where it's legal, they could, and it certainly can come up if you are arrested for something else as part of a case built against you for deportation. And so just recognizing what that means is that at any point, the way that our government is set up is that our federal laws preempt our local laws. And so while there has been a sort of respect for the fact that states have passed laws, the truth of the matter is the feds trump the state. And so this is still a crime at its core. And that's going to be more important for vulnerable populations than it is for, just anybody walking down the street. In much the same way that we've seen these laws play out otherwise, right? So those same power dynamics that exist are the people I'm still worried about now, even though it's illegal in California.
So we also have another question that came in from Monterey. And the question just disappeared.
Oh. We have their audio.
Can you hear me?
Hi there, David.
All right. So this is David's computer. My name is Najib Kamil. I'm from Santa Cruz County Child Welfare. And my question was, and I typed it in as well, just in case the audio didn't work, but how are social services and like specifically child welfare engaging in the concept of ACEs in the work that they do? And specifically, I'm interested in looking at child abuse prevention and not after they get into our system, though that's another piece of it, but really looking at the prevention piece around that.
There are conversations I know that are happening of the Department of Social Services beginning to think about what they can do in terms of prevention. The real challenge is that our social service system is set up the exact same way as our medical system, right? It is designed to respond to things that have happened, but not really to mobilize for prevention. We all have the same problem. So we're all in the same boat together. So we can't point our fingers at anybody because there are 4 pointing right back at us. And that is true for them. So they've really been organized around how do we respond to child abuse needs and not how do we mobilize all the resources that are available to a family once they're in CPS before a CPS case has to be opened. And that is the question that's been on the table now. I want to really elevate some of the work that the California Youth Connection has been doing in raising awareness around this issue and using, and not using, but working with and amplifying the voices of foster youth in organizing around some of the state policies that directly affect them. And that would be both preventive as well as would be in the primary sense, but also preventive in a secondary sense for them. And so some of the things that I know have been proposed that have not yet been executed have been things like how do we mobilize for people who before children are removed from a home to ensure that there can be parenting classes and that there can be additional support to be able to help children stay in a home. And what do we do to kind of keep that placement to the greatest extent we can? Because we recognize that, sure, removing a child from a home where they are unsafe can be certainly a protective factor, but you're also creating a trauma because you are creating separation. And so we really need to use that tool judiciously and not have it be the main one in our toolbox. So yeah, there's a lot of work that still has to be done in the social service sector, and they are grappling with it in the same way that we are in the medical and allied health professionals.
So I'm going to just give a quick shout out because I know that I know Najib, and he is actually probably understating himself. Santa Cruz as well as Napa County attended a summit in San Diego, co-sponsored by Strategies 2.0 and OCAP and Department of Social Services and Child Welfare Directors to launch county plans, collaborative county plans for primary prevention. And Santa's got a lot of creative ideas, as does Napa, and we're working with a number of counties. So
Najib, why
that's a good development.
You were supposed to ask a question. You were supposed to tell us about the race.
Supposed to brag.
And admittedly, I have more of a state level perspective, so I can kind of tell you what's happening there because of all the state policies that we do. So, you know, there are a lot of times when there's great work happening at the county that eventually will become a state policy because of how successful you are, that I don't hear about until somebody's like, because of the work that happened in Contra Costa, we want to introduce AB 1000 to do da-da-da. And I'm like, what? What's Contra Costa up to the last 5 years? So yes, it's certainly a learning experience. So if you have some things that you all are already doing, please don't ask a question. Tell me about them. Yes. Oh, and Najib, to your point, the other thing is that a lot of counties I have heard have been piloting some things using their innovation funds from Prop 63, which is the Mental Health Services Act. So that has been a big thing that, especially after, you know, a lot of counties came under fire for not spending all their money and had to, that one of the places that they've been looking is that innovation fund is a way to be able to begin to think about how to address some of these things in multiple sectors beyond just health. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I don't see any, or comments. Blanca, did you get your question answered? Okay, all right. Yes, if there are any other questions or comments, please feel free. I see a hand. That is a great question, and I promise you were not planted in the audience, but we should certainly consider planting you in the future. I would definitely encourage the people in this area to be a part of Resilient Napa. There also is, which is part of the ACES Connection. So ACES Connection is an organization that really is international, but has a lot of work that's happening in California. And so there are local chapters like Resilient Napa. I'm part of Resilient Sacramento. There's Resilient Yolo. They're all over the state. And that's a great way to stay connected to other people locally who are doing this work and engaged in the topic. The other thing I would encourage all of you to consider is that there is an event on May 1st in Sacramento called the 4CA Policymaker Education Day. It is free and open to the public to come and learn how to talk about these issues with our state legislators. And so that is an all-day thing. I think it's like 9 to 4 that day if you are available. And 4CA is the California Campaign to Counter Childhood Adversity. So that's a great opportunity to come and meet other people who are doing some of this work, and then also have an opportunity to have FaceTime with some of your legislators to begin to share the importance of this with them and thinking about some of the policies that have been introduced this year that we want them to support, and also just in general for them to really prioritize this area and keep it in the forefront throughout their time in the legislature.
For our chat friend Blanca.
So this group's question is, could you address the conflict of the ACE questionnaire revelations of child abuse and the responsibilities of a mandated reporter's responsibility to report?
Yes, so that is one of the things that has come up a lot is if you actually get the results back of the ACEs questionnaire and someone indicates ongoing abuse, it's less of a problem when you're dealing with adults taking the question retrospectively. It's a problem when you're asking the question of children and the abuse may be ongoing. And so again, one of the ways that some people have gotten around this is asking parents to fill it out and then only report to them a score, whether either a number or a range. But yes, there is an inherent conflict in there in terms of if somebody comes and says this about a child, you're a mandatory reporter, and so you have to report. And so there are ways to still be able to provide services to that family without having to know exactly which ACEs are affected. There are questions about whether or not you want to know which one so that you can more easily direct, what your intervention and what your, and how you may be able to support that family. And so some of what has come up is recognizing the need to be able to talk about this body of work in general, and then have an additional conversation with a family about the possibility of disclosing if it's any of these and how we can support that family and that sort of thing. So yes, there is an inherent conflict in there. There are some ways to be able to get around the need to mandatory report if you want to do something else with the information. But there also is that question about, does knowing exactly what allow us to better serve the community? And that's one of the things that I think a lot of us in the field are grappling with, when it's appropriate to do which and how. Because what we certainly don't want to do is have every person who comes into a clinical service be screened for this and then end up having a CPS, being referred to CPS, right? That's not going to encourage people to come and engage in primary care or emergency services at all, right? And that's not what we want to see happen. So when do we do the full screen, and when do we do the initial screen that just kind of helps us recognize what we may need to support in the immediate term, is one of the questions that's come up. And one of the things that between the Office of Safe and Healthy Communities and the screening money that would come down from the state and some of the other supportive work that we would be trying to answer. And that we will likely get wrong many times before we get right, if I'm being totally honest. The question is, how wrong will we be? And that answer, I hope, is not that wrong. Are there any other questions or comments? Corey.
Learned a lot and have many things that I'm going to stop, and continue.
Yay! Yes. I would love
This work,
that.
yeah.
I would absolutely love
Yeah.
that. I really appreciate having been able to come down here. Of course, the drive is beautiful, so I really appreciate that. And thank you all for being here, especially those of you who've been here twice. I really appreciate your commitment to this work. And though some of you did not get to see the Star Wars presentation last time, I will still end with, may the force be with you.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Topper. So we recognize the time. We're hoping that folks would bear with us for just about 10 more minutes, if that's okay. If folks can nod your head really quickly, if that works okay for folks. So like we had mentioned earlier, learning communities is not just about bringing you information, but it's really about creating space for community and creating an opportunity for us to get to know each other and get to know what's going on in the community as well. So with that said, I'm not going to have you move, but we're just going to take a really quick, 4 minutes or so. If folks can just get into groups of 2 or 3, or 3 or 4, let's say. So you can probably a little bit because of the theater style seating, but we'll just answer the second one. So, like Dr. Coffer was really articulate in describing, there's so much we talk about and recognize in terms of the negative or the challenges or the barriers, right? Trauma, poverty, oppression, racism, etc. And oftentimes we're not pivoting to focus on the positive. So instead, in small groups, if we can answer this question, that there is so much that we're fighting against? What are we fighting for? And with that thinking, what are you all doing in your organizations or for yourselves? So if folks can really quickly just discuss that, we'll come back together just after a few minutes, share in popcorn style, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, got it. Us too. Good luck.
Because I can pull it out right through the door. And I can put more people. Hi, Becca. Hi, Becca. Very nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.